Welcome to the Surviving Society collaborative and ongoing series with Sage Publishing's Social Science for Social Justice book series. This series reflects Sage's mission-driven approach to publishing by platforming emerging voices and enabling the dissemination of bold thinking that will inform the work of future generations of scholars and changemakers. In these episodes, we talk to authors from the book series about their research embedded in visions for social justice for all. I'm so excited today to be joined by Harshad Keval, who has written Whiteness, Racial Trauma and the University. Harshad, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Chantal. Thank you for the invite. It's really, really great to be here.
Now, I have been so privileged over the years to talk to so many different amazing researchers, academics, social activists that have particular life stories that kind of bring them into scholarship. And as we're going to discuss in this episode, Harshad, yours is no different to many of those stories. But we sort of, in our pre-chat, I was asking you about your last name, because one of the things that kept happening when I was scheduling this episode, because we hadn't met before, on email, I kept accidentally calling you Keval, because I've met some Kevals whose first names are Kevals. And then I just said to you as we were talking, Harshad, can you tell me a bit about your last name? Because I keep putting it as your first name, and I don't know if that's my ignorance or there's something else afoot here.
Right, so no, absolutely not. It's not your ignorance at all, Chantal. Keval is commonly a first name on the Indian subcontinent, but because of my family origins and the migration story that we have, like so many people, we've moved around 3 or 4 or 5 different countries. So with my dad originally being from Burma and my mum from India, they met in India, but for work reasons, my dad went over to the eastern border of Africa, and as he was sort of getting ready with his, identity papers, his name was stamped with the surname Keval, because that was my granddad's first name. And the border officials there, of course, former colonial officers controlling who goes in and out of the country, decided to call my dad with the surname Keval. And so as he entered Africa, and of course in Zambia, where we settled, where the kids were born, we all had the surname Keval. So yeah, absolutely, it is. I often get called Keval by people, and I end up having to kind of correct them and then explain. So no, thanks for asking.
Honestly, Harshad, it's like the colonial stamp, like the crossing of borders, like empire, so much in names. I always find it so fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing that story with us. And
no, you're very welcome.
This brings me to the book. So the book, Harshad, in so many points, it's so poignant, challenging and difficult to read. I think for many academics of colour, there's a lot of your story which is very relatable. I think for the listeners that are outside of the academy, we're very much talking about institutional racism and how it impacts our micro social relations, how it impacts our interpersonal lives, how it impacts our sense of self. And I think locating this within the workplace is always such a powerful thing to do, and that's what you've been able to do in this book. And I just want to say, on behalf of our vast community or global community of academics of colour, thank you so much for writing this book, Harshad.
Thank you, Chantal, for that. That's amazing to hear, actually. And as I was saying to you earlier, I'm a massive fan of Surviving Society. As I was saying earlier, it really is a beacon of light and hope, right? So for so many of us doing this work, it's so fantastic to be able to listen to the kinds of interviews you do and the kind of work you do. And in many ways, this work really just comes out of that set of movements. It's really shoulder to shoulder alongside so many people who are doing this kind of work. And I think something really important to me, the voices, right? Who gets heard? Who gets the opportunity and the privilege to talk about these things, to actually direct our attention to those things that are going on in institutional structures that, on the one hand, become really popular to dissect and look at analytically, whilst still so many of us experience these very powerful institutional mechanisms and structures of oppression, which don't seem to be going away anytime soon.
No.
So I think being able to write this in a way that kind of retains some voice and some sense of experience. The experiential inside this is so important. So I guess that's the starting point of the book, really, is being able to create a coherent moment so that we're not just intellectualizing racial oppression and racial violence in institutions, but we're actually able to talk about its visceral impact, the very realness of it, and the way in which it impacts different people, racialized differently across the institutional structure. Now, I'm very aware that as a British, Asian, Indian man, there are different types of racialization going on for me as than they are to someone else who adopts or has a different intersectional identity. So yeah, it was a starting point for me.
Harsha, thank you so much for sharing that. I think one of the terms that you use in this book, which kind of made me like gasp in understanding, appreciation, shock, but also like, wow, yeah, that is exactly what this is. White narcissistic structures. Can you tell us what you mean by white narcissistic structures? I've been reading a lot about narcissism recently. Absolutely fascinating.
It's a tough one, this one. And it's a question I've often had to ask myself to make sure there's some clarity in what I'm thinking. I mean, I guess I also want to, before I go into that, I do want to say that the book doesn't really provide a whole series of cookbook answers for institutional racism and whiteness. Like, I think there's a lot of expectation on academics working in this field to solve the problem. And my sense is that I'm trying to move away from solving the problem, instead by asking provocative questions. One of the provocative questions that kept on coming back to me, and this comes out of discussions and observations and experiences, is that what kind of system would it take? What kind of a mechanism would it take inside an institutional structure like a university that has its own colonial roots and histories, right, of subjugating populations through, science and intellect and academic study of different races? It's got its own history of that. But what I'm interested in is we're in a moment when there's never been more information, knowledge, and discussion about the problems of race and racism. There's never been, we're in an unprecedented publishing moment around whiteness and institutional racism and structures. So suddenly, every university in the country is anti-racist. Every single one of them is doing decolonizing. Every single one of them is embedded inside EDI structures. And yet, we are still seeing the reproduction and the regeneration of the multiple forms of inequality and harm. And I think that harm is a form of racial trauma. And I asked myself, what kind of system would it take to, on the one hand, continue the production of that harm, and on the other hand, continually deflect and then convince everybody that what it's doing is wonderful and good and liberal? And it has to be a series of narcissistic manipulations inside whiteness structures that allow this to happen. Narcissism, as a personality characteristic or as a psychological structure, narcissism cannot deal with any reflection given back to it that doesn't idolize and idealize itself. It demands shiny, happy, beautiful surfaces around it so they keep on reflecting back its own brilliance. And I'm constantly thinking about what colonial whiteness structures were. They were always demanding the subjugated, racialized populations to be in a particular subservient position, to be oppressed, to continue being oppressed for the extraction of labor. If we look around society, the constant denial, disavowal, distraction away from the racializing power of whiteness tells me that there's a narcissistic mechanism inside whiteness that is in operation in universities. And I kind of, in the book, I kind of use this, it's kind of like a containment space, in a sense, that I call whiteness. So white narcissistic structures becomes a thing that I can use to say, well, there's something driving the problems in universities right now. Given that apparently they're all anti-racist and we've still got lots of racialized problems going on.
I think that when you talk about the kind of the reflecting back its greatness and how universities are reliant on the subjugated doing that, it really reminds me of kind of how hegemony works. But it also makes me look at myself in that I think as much as I try to be critical or like a critical friend of the institution, and I have to say critical friend of the institution because I'm in the institution, I'm employed by the institution, I think that I am myself susceptible to reproducing these kind of this kind of narcissism within the institution, on the condition that they provide us with some concessions, whether that be some ring-fenced PhD studentships, or whether that be research funding, or whether that be the opportunity to distribute resources. And I guess one thing that I wanted to ask you, Harshad, is like, as we continue to strive for quote unquote concessions and in effect at times help to facilitate this hegemonic condition, are we stopping the dismantling of something much bigger that could be much more emancipatory for everyone?
So it's a really big question.
Yeah.
I think all of us are, in a sense, imbricated. We're involved inside these tensions, and I think we can't really get away from that. I
Yeah.
think a lot of it depends on on our intentions and our groundedness in networks outside of the institution. I think if we rely just solely on what we might call resistance or the good work inside those walls and inside those frameworks, then I think the way in which these racial regimes work, and I call university a racial regime in one of my early chapters, is that it will fundamentally harm the process of liberation. It will fundamentally, in fact, counter dismantle what it is we're trying to do. So I think, in a sense, we can all be part of the problem, and we can all be trying to work at being part of a solution. But I
Yeah.
think that tension isn't going to be eased anytime soon.
No.
I think there's so much. I mean, I think the kind of hope and aspiration lies actually in what we're seeing around us. I mean, I can't really get away from, having this book out, published in the public domain, without also acknowledging that it arises in a field when we're seeing right now the power of protests. We're seeing right now the power of what students and what faculty, when they come together, can do when they say, actually, we see the hypocrisies in institutions. We see the racializing potential of everyday stuff in universities, especially on campus. And I think, in a sense, we're kind of almost seeing live action right now about how more and more people are willing to call out what the fabric of institutional university structures is really about, which is about maintaining a particular facade, which itself is part of the neoliberal, hegemony that we're in. So I
Yeah.
think we're all part of. If we're working inside a structure, then I think we're going to be part of that tension relationship always. But it doesn't mean that we don't continue the work, right? We figure out, and this is part of the survival that is so kind of so fundamental to people like me who, I'm just in a small part of the academic world, minding my business, trying my best to do what I can. And I'm relying so much on this amazing movement around me.
Yeah. That's a beautiful answer. Thank you so much, Harshad. I just want to roll back. I want to roll back and talk a little bit about something that the listeners will know I'm always really interested in, and that's the kind of the scholar, the person behind the book, and like your journey into getting to this book and writing this book. I wondered, like, where did it all start? Like, how did you know that this is the kind of work that you wanted to do?
Yeah, I never really knew this was the kind of work I wanted to do, to be honest. I was going to put a subtitle to this book, sort of comically, that's the internal monologue in my head, which is, The Long Goodbye. Because
Yeah.
in my opening kind of words, in a sense, for racialized academics or racially minoritized or people of color working in academia, I think there's always a sense of longing. And
Yeah.
that is that I've done the work and I've got my education, I've fought those battles, I'm now in. And Josh Myers, in his wonderful book of Black Study, kind of refers to this, saying, so many promises are made all along the way. And once you get in there, we suddenly realize that, good grief, we're not meant to be here at all.
No.
And in the book, I write about how we are baked out of the design at the very start. We're not in the ingredients that went into the formulation of the system. And so my journey, I suppose, has been about partly trying and longing and trying to get into a position where I can do this interesting work, and only realizing fairly late in that actually this is trickery. And this is the amazing trickery of modernity and the Enlightenment, actually, which is that if you play by these rules and you achieve and attain these epistemic hierarchical positions, then you too can be validated by the systems of power. Um, and it never happens. It never happens because this is how power, whiteness, and coloniality work, from my observations. So I guess my journey has been really bouncing around different things. And I took a really good bit of advice from someone many, many, many years ago from a different field who probably heard me whinging and complaining about my career this and career that. And he said to me, don't think about your career. Just try and work with good people and do interesting things and forget everything you think you know about careers. And I kind of stuck with me. And so my identity as a scholar or as an activist or as a writer has really been about this one thing, which is how do I, in any given moment, express myself in a way which doesn't contribute to the harm that I'm trying to battle against. And that is the only criteria I have, to be quite honest with you. I have never been able to climb around on the ladders that get people up on those higher positions. And I've never really had an interest because of that, because it's really this is a creative output for me.
Like, I'm always interested in the who behind ideas and a come into oneself and self-actualization. Like, you mentioned a colleague saying to you, like, focus on working with good people and working on interesting things, but the kind of the consciousness that you're sort of talking about, self-actualization you're talking about, who put that in you? Where did that come from?
So, like most people, a variety of different sources. We are a migratory people. We're part of the South Asian diaspora.
Yeah.
So we've gone all over the place. So, as a working class Lancashire kid.
Come on, this is what we want to hear. Yes.
Right. So I grew up in a white working class mill town. My dad had a corner shop, and this was my life.
Wow.
Right? And so, on the one hand, we were the only Asian people inside this working class white community, but we became the fabric of everything that was going on there. And so, growing up, having to navigate these different worlds, where I was a little Asian kid who was born in Africa, had ended up in Lancashire of all places, but wanted to go places and do things. And there was a whole series of different influences around me, I guess. Part of it was my identity as a working class Lancashire lad, which has stayed with me all the way through.
Yeah.
And kind of keeps me grounded in many ways. Part of it is a whole series of other influences. I mean, writers and kind of other activists, older siblings. And part of it is, I think you mentioned self-actualization. For me, the need and the demand to be able to express oneself in whichever way, in the truest possible way, I think is a really powerful instinct that often gets damaged or dampened in institutions like academia, because we're not really encouraged to express. We're not encouraged to find multimodal ways of doing research, right? There's a particular way to do research. You've got your concepts, you've got your research methods, you've got your publication process, now stick to it. And I kind of make sure that I'm working myself into every situation I can when I'm trying to do the work, because otherwise it becomes an artifice. And so I end up losing authenticity. So in my learning and teaching, for example, I bring aspects of my identity as fundamental forms of sharing and potential vulnerability to the students. So, whether it's self-actualization through experiences in martial arts or philosophy of combat, or whether it's, my identity as a working class kid, whatever it is, it comes into that interface where we bring baggage to a situation. And in my learning and teaching, I allow the students to open up about themselves. And where the two places meet, something quite often good happens. So I guess part of my kind of journey and my scholarship.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Harshad. Like, I love the emphasis on subjectivity, but also the emphasis on our personal histories and our sociological imagination, like how all of this is so integral to what we do and what drives us as scholars. And I really like what you said earlier in the conversation about how, like, you then reach the institutions, you're like, oh my God, actually this isn't for us. And I think one of the reasons why I often talk to academics like yourself, about where we came from or how we come to do this work is because so often the institution or the actual quote unquote battle in doing social justice work within the institution, like we can forget. And I'm not saying that's what you were saying at all, but it's more kind of for myself and for the listeners, like to encourage us to draw back on, like, where did we come from intellectually? Like, what helped us grow? What pushed us? And these are the kind of memories or the memories that we can draw on that push us forwards in trying to make these structures and institutions more equitable spaces.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that also I had the privilege of kind of being involved in, privilege of having a memory of, is that in very early years, when I was studying in London, we had a guest lecture come to the university, and I was doing my master's, and of course I knew Stuart Hall's work, right? Who didn't? And so I turned up at this amazing guest lecture, and I thought, wow, the Stuart Hall is walking into the auditorium. And I sat there, and it was in 1996 and 1997 when he gave his famous floating, race as a floating signifier talk,
You
right?
saw the race as a floating signifier talk.
Chantal, I'm there in the second or third row, right? If you
Oh my days! That is sick.
So I'm sitting there, and I was trying to do sociology, and I was trying to learn more about the craft and the trade, and finding my own challenges. And I wasn't, but if I'm in all honesty, I wasn't particularly race conscious. I didn't know enough about the concepts in I didn't know enough about it. Listening to Stuart Hall in that moment, honestly, it utterly changed the direction of my life.
Wow.
But it didn't do so until later. It remained dormant. It kind of, the experience sat with me, and for one reason or another, I couldn't break into academia. I just couldn't get into it. I couldn't get onto a PhD program after that. I couldn't find work doing research. And so I made a decision to leave. And in fact, I left the UK. I went off to Europe, and I worked there for 5 years. But it was only on returning after 5 or 6 years that the stuff that had been kind of foundations that had been laid, right, slowly started rising to my consciousness. And I started being able to start formulate an understanding of race-class dialectics and the powers of coloniality and the way in which discourse works and colonial structures in history. And it was probably that pivotal moment where I was able to listen to Stuart Hall, and kind of I've been so grateful ever since for that one experience, because it's kind of really shaped how I think and my intentions since.
Oh, Harshad, that is such an incredible story to share on this podcast. Like, and also just even outside of that story in your own personal biography there, I think bringing in this example is such a good reminder for all of us listening, whether you're an academic, a researcher, or not at all, or you're just someone that's really interested in this work. Like, time is temporal, and ideas and people stay in our hearts and they are experiences that don't leave us, but they might not necessarily be something that we use or draw on in the particular stage of life we're in at this time. But it might be that it comes to you later. And I think that hearing stories like yours and reading books like this, it is a reminder of the seasonal nature of life, but that like there's no wasted moment, there's no wasted text, there's no wasted thinking time. Like it's all part of the journey.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think we're academia is a funny old thing.
Yeah.
It really is. It's a very particular structure, and I kind of talk about it a little bit in the book, but it does something funny with the time space continuum, because it convinces us that in any given moment you've got to have particular things in place and that they exist for that moment, and then that's all there is to it. That linearity is very dangerous, you know, and that linearity of time actually is a colonial product, right? If you look at the cosmologies of existence and time in global South across indigenous communities in history, that linearity doesn't exist. Time is a very circular, cyclical, wonderful thing that keeps on revisiting us, and we're able to revisit memories and use them time and time again in different situations. And I think academia is a very particular type of colonial modernity structure that can be very harmful to the way in which we interact with each other. It atomizes us, it individualizes us, and it prevents these connective solidarities between groups that we need. And I think what you were saying, Chantal, about having these moments that we can absorb, we can take in, and then allow to sit with for a while, I think is such an important thing, because we can draw upon that as a strength later on.
It's exactly what I was thinking as you were sort of referring back to it. Was not until 5 years after you had seen Stuart Hall give the famous lecture that you were really able to draw on it. And yeah, just hearing stories like that give me hope, particularly in times when I'm feeling intellectually trodden on, let's say. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. Just one final question, Harshad. Audiences or readers that are not currently situated or working or studying within the academy or within the university, so audiences out beyond the institution, what can they take from this book?
Oh, wow. Okay. I think, I guess one of the things that I'm saying is that in the midst of all this information and knowledge around racism and anti-racism,
Yeah.
how is it that universities suddenly became anti-racist, right? Because when a university says we're anti-racist or we're decolonizing, my first question, and something that I have done in the past, you know, and I've, you know, not been very popular for it, but that's the name of the game, is I've asked the question, if you're anti-racist now as an institution, what were you before, right? And if you're anti-racist now, then what understanding of race and racisms and anti-racism as a history do you have? Because you can't simply badge yourself as anti-racist without having any of the richness of all the different communities who come together to make anti-racism what it is. So one thing audiences can take away is that the book actually points to this phenomena and allows us to take a moment and breathe and say, hold on a second, what's actually going on here? When a university says they're decolonizing, or they have decolonized now, they tick the box, can you really do decolonizing something inside an institution that continues to operate at the coloniality level and coloniality and power level? Can you really decolonize something if you have very little understanding of the richness of decoloniality over the last 300 years? And so in a way, I guess I'm pointing to these things. So something the audiences can take away is they can read the book and go, yeah, you know what? There's some questions here that need to be asked, because we're all asked to move along. We're all pushed along with the momentum of, hey, it's a liberal, progressive institution, so everything's hunky-dory. Where there are instances of race or race making or racisms, they're just individual snapshots. They're anomalies. Actually, we know they're not. They're part and parcel of what the system produces as a normal state of being. So I guess one of the things that readers can take away is we can start asking these very provocative questions. from the power base of connected solidarities with each other, because we can't do it individually.
Harshad, that is a beautiful place and a powerful and instructive place to end. Thank you so much for joining us. And listeners, you can get the book. Check out the link in the episode notes. Harshad, thank you so much for this contribution to knowledge and scholarship. Like, there's so much in this book and so much that listeners and readers are going to be able to take away. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Chantal. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Surviving Society.
To support our work, you can rate,
review and subscribe to host or produce a series of Surviving Society.
Get in touch with us via Twitter or Instagram.